Dear people watching and listening, Assalamu alaikum. Kindly like and share this video and subscribe to my YouTube channel. Please support my channel by contributing to my Patreon account so that I can continue making the audiobook series. Salah ad-Deen al-Ayubi, Volume 2, The Establishment of the Ayyubid State. Start of Part 5 of Chapter 7. Salah ad-Din's relationship with the Crusaders before Hattin. Salah ad-Din aimed to unite Egypt and Greater Syria in order to achieve victory over the Crusaders. At the same time, he realized that resisting and engaging the Crusaders could not wait until complete union was achieved. Hence he relied on a strategy of working on these two goals, the aim of unity and the aim of resisting the Crusaders, by making the most of any circumstances that might be helpful in resisting the Crusaders. In the midst of all that, Salah ad-Din did not neglect to follow certain strategies, including the following. He worked to increase fortifications in the areas under his control in Egypt and Syria. Whether that was by increasing his military forces and paying attention to their two sections, on land and on sea, or by working on building fortresses and citadels that would give him and his forces better protection, or make them lookout points where he could keep a watch on Crusader fortifications. So he paid attention to fortifying Cairo, Alexandria, and Damietta, and he built fortresses in Greater Syria, such as the citadel of Ajloun. For the same reason, he tried to gain control of the citadels and fortresses that were under Crusader control, and strove to prevent or block the Crusaders' efforts to build citadels and fortresses that could threaten Muslim areas. He strove to form agreements with anyone who could affect the Crusaders' supply line, and that would have a positive effect on the Islamic front economically and militarily. The focus in this regard was on the Italian merchant cities. He even resorted to entering into truces with some of the Crusaders in order to be able to focus on fighting others, taking advantage of the Crusaders' situation and the disputes between them, especially that between the Kingdom of Jerusalem and the County of Tripoli. Salah ad-Din took advantage of these truces in order to focus on completing military fortifications, or working to achieve complete unity, because circumstances did not allow him to fight on more than one front at the same time. In order to achieve this, Salah ad-Din benefited from circumstances that favored the interests of the Islamic front that was heading towards unity at a time when the Crusader front was on the decline, according to the historian Robert Payne. Salah ad-Din also benefited from the spirit of jihad, which began to take shape clearly from the time of Imad ad-Din Zangi and his son Nuruddin after him. When speaking of the battles that Salah ad-Din al-Ayubi fought against the Crusaders during this period, we should realize that there were many battles in more than one location, but this stage did not reach the level of all-out war with the Crusaders. Several important battles were fought. Crusader raids against Salah ad-Din's possessions from 570 to 572 Hijri. The first task that Raymond III set for himself as regent of Jerusalem was to stop the growth of Salah ad-Din's power and prevent him from annexing Aleppo. Hence the Crusaders launched continuous raids on his possessions during the confrontation between him and the Zangids. These raids had little impact and were limited geographically, however, because the Crusaders themselves were in a state of turmoil. In Muharram 571 Hijri, that is 1175 Common Era, The Crusader king Baldwin IV took advantage of the fact that Salah ad-Din was distracted and had to cool things down in his conflict with the Crusaders in order to focus on fighting Saif ad-Din Ghazi, ruler of Mosul, so that he would not be fighting on two fronts at the same time, namely the Zengids in the north and east, and the Crusaders in the south and west. Therefore he renewed the truce with the Kingdom of Jerusalem. But the Crusaders broke the truce in the following year, in the midst of the ongoing conflict between Salah ad-Din and the Zengids. They attacked the lands that were under Salah ad-Din's control, and Reynald III, ruler of Tripoli, attacked the Bekaa region at a time when the royal army marched from the south, led by the king and Humphrey of Toron. It seems that Reynald III was defeated by Ibn al-Muqaddim, the Emir of Baalbek, but the two Crusader armies joined together and confronted Shams ad-Dawlah Turan Shah, Salah ad-Din's brother and deputy in Damascus, at Anjar in the Bekaa. He had gone out to save Baalbek, but this confrontation was not decisive. Hardly had Salah ad-Din arrived from the north when the Crusaders withdrew from the area. He did not pursue them. He preferred to go back to Egypt, leaving his brother Turan Shah in Damascus. The Crusaders raid Homs and Hamah. Undoubtedly, the Crusaders lost a golden opportunity to strike at Salah ad-Din in Egypt, at the time when he had not yet consolidated his position in northern Syria, because circumstances were ripe for them after the Byzantine emperor had put all his efforts into making the campaign succeed. Time would tell that this opportunity was one that would never be repeated for the Crusaders after that. The joint Crusader-Byzantine venture against Egypt had failed, but that did not prevent the Crusaders from benefiting from the Dutch campaign against the Muslim lands that were controlled by Salah ad-Din in Syria. On 4th Rabiul Awwal, 572 Hijri, that is 11th September 1176 Common Era, Salah ad-Din left Syria for Egypt after making a peace deal with al-Malik Saleh Ismail, ruler of Aleppo. Baldwin IV took advantage of this opportunity and repeated his request to Philip of Alsace to attack the Muslim forces that were concentrated on the eastern borders of the principalities of Edessa and Tripoli. The latter agreed to his request. He left Jerusalem in Rabiul Thani, 573 Hijri, that was the end of October 1177 Common Era, heading north to help Reynald III, Count of Tripoli, and Bohemond III, Prince of Antioch, based on their request, as they viewed it possible to achieve something in the absence of Salah ad-Din. The king supplied 100 knights and 2,000 foot soldiers. One detachment of the army raided Homs, but was ambushed and lost all the booty it had acquired. In the meantime, Philip and Reynald III, with their forces, raided Hamah, which almost fell, were it not that the Muslims stood firm in defending it and repelled them, frustrated, after a siege that lasted for 4 days without achieving anything. It seems that the drought which affected the area in that year was one of the reasons for this raid. In the letter which was written by al-Qadi al-Fadil to be sent to Baghdad, and signed by Salah ad-Din, there is an indication to that effect. The disbelievers came out to Syria, breaking the deal that they had agreed to, and committing an act of blatant treachery, thinking that they would be able to finish off Syria, because it was suffering from drought, and they besieged Hama on Monday, 21 Jamadiul Awwal. Raid on Harim. Harim was a city located east of the Orontes, 12 miles from Antioch. The Prince of Antioch, Bohemond III, asked Philip of Alsace to launch an attack against the city of Harim, and promised to help him. So Philip headed towards Harim, accompanied by Raymond III. At that time, Harim was under the rule of Gumushtegin, the former Atabeg of al-Malik al-Saleh Ismail. It was in a state of internal turmoil because its people supported Gumushtegin, who was engaged in a dispute with al-Malik al-Saleh Ismail. Harim was besieged by the Crusaders at the beginning of Jamad-ul-Thani, that is November, whereupon the people of Harim forgot about their differences and resisted the siege, which lasted for 4 months. Their resistance was courageous. At the same time, the people of Aleppo started to launch raids on nearby Crusader lands. As-Saleh Ismail sent a detachment which penetrated the Crusader lines and joined the city garrison in Harim. At this time, Salah ad-Din set out from Egypt to attack the kingdom of Jerusalem, which had no one to defend it, and the Crusaders were afraid that the Aleppans would seek his help. They also decided to help the kingdom of Jerusalem, but al-Malik al-Saleh Ismail negotiated for a lifting of the siege in return for payment of a sum of money. He also warned them that he would hand the city over to Salah ad-Din, so the Crusaders ended their siege and failed to capture the city. The Battle of Ramlah. This battle was a bitter experience for Salah ad-Din, but perhaps he learned from it that it was a mistake to take on the Crusaders before achieving unity among the Muslims. By unifying the Muslims, he would gain access to a huge power that was willing to make sacrifices in order to destroy the potential enemy force, in addition to the fact that he would be able to move his army within a large area. Salah ad-Din had annexed a significant part of Greater Syria into his state, along with Egypt, since he headed to Damascus in 570 Hijri, that is 1174 Common Era. He had then annexed Homs, Hamah, and Harim. Nevertheless, there was still a large area that lay beyond his authority. After Salah ad-Din returned to Egypt in 572 Hijri, that is 1176 Common Era, he decided to launch a campaign against the Crusaders. He set out from Cairo with 20,000 warriors in Jamad-ul-Awwal, 573 Hijri, that is November 1177 Common Era, and camped at the Egyptian city of Bilbis, 10 parasangs from the city of Pustat on the road to Syria. Then he headed towards the southern part of Palestine and camped at Ascalon, which was under Crusader occupation. There he managed to capture some Crusaders and issued orders that they be executed. Salah ad-Din did not encounter any resistance worth mentioning from the enemy, so his troops went about freely, raiding villages and collecting booty. Then Salah ad-Din gathered some of his troops and advanced with them towards the town of Ramlah, near the coast, which was one of the largest cities of Palestine at the time. They were faced with the river of Tel Safiya, so they spread out looking for a suitable place to cross it. Whilst they were doing so, a force of Crusaders attacked them before they could organize themselves. It seems that the Crusaders had been watching their movements and took them by surprise at the right time. Their leader was the infamous Reynald de Chatillon, who was supported in his mission by Baldwin III, King of Jerusalem. At that moment, there was no one with Salah ad-Din except a few of his emirs and troops, because most of them had gone off in pursuit of booty. The confrontations began and the troops of Salah ad-Din gathered and fought the Crusaders. Some of Salah ad-Din's commanders and close companions did well, especially Taqi ad-Din Umar and his son Ahmed, and Diya Isa al-Hakari and his brother Zahir ad-Din. They were taken captive and remained in captivity for 2 years. Then Salah ad-Din ransomed al-Faqih Isa for 60,000 dinars. Taqi ad-Din Umar went forward and began to fight courageously before his uncle, and killed a number of Crusaders. Then his son Ahmed went forward and showed a great deal of courage, killing a number of the enemy, and returned to his father. His father told him to go back again, saying to him, "Go back, Ahmed, for going back into battle is good." So he went back and fought them and was martyred. Despite their bravery, the Muslims could not withstand the attack. Salah ad-Din spoke of the defeat and how the change in the position of the troops and the flanks of the army led to this regrettable outcome. At the time when the enemy came close, some soldiers thought that the right flank should move to the left, and the left flank to the core, so that the hill in Ramlah would be behind them and not in front of them. Whilst they were busy doing this, the enemy attacked them. Reasons for the defeat in the Battle of Ramlah. There were several factors that led to the defeat of the Ayyubid forces in this battle. 1. The Crusaders surprised the Ayyubid army at the right time, whilst they were dispersed and before they could organize themselves. 2. This surprise attack led to confusion in the ranks and flanks of the Ayyubid army, and the scattering of their commanders, so they resorted to individual combat, which was of no benefit in that situation. 3. Salah ad-Din disappeared from sight until it was thought that he had been killed. And 4. The Ayyubid army was far from its supply lines and cut off from supplies and water. What confirms the extent of this great loss that befell the Ayyubid army in this battle was what the historian said about this defeat. It was a setback which Allah compensated only with the Battle of Hattin. In this battle, most of those who were with Salah ad-Din were killed, wounded, or captured, but amazingly he emerged unscathed. After the defeat was complete, one of the Crusaders charged at him and got so close that he almost reached him, but the Crusader was killed in front of him. The Franks piled up against Salah ad-Din and he fled, marching a little then pausing, so that his troops could catch up with him, until night fell. He traveled by land and continued with a small group until he reached Egypt. They met with a great deal of hardship along the way. They began to run out of food and water, and their mounts died from hunger, thirst, and being ridden too fast. On the way to Egypt, Salah ad-Din vanished from sight, which created fear in the ranks. Al-Qadi al-Fadil set out with some of his companions to look for him, and he sent them into the middle of the desert until they found him and helped him with the supplies that they were carrying. Then the caravan reached Cairo in the middle of Jamadi-ul-Sani, 573 Hijri, that is December 1175 Common Era. But news of his being safe and sound had reached Cairo on fast camels, before he himself arrived, so as to put a stop to anyone who might be thinking of rebelling against his rule, especially the supporters of the Fatimids. In order to confirm that he was still alive, when he arrived in Cairo, carrier pigeons carried the good news to all parts of Egypt, to put people's minds at rest. The Battle of Ramlah was a hard experience for Salah ad-Din. He apparently learned a great deal from it in later confrontations, as it was the first and last major defeat for him and his forces at the hands of the Crusader commanders. Salah ad-Din realized another fact that had to do with this battlefront against the Crusaders, which was that the supply lines between his base in Cairo and the plains of Palestine were too long. There was too much difficulty involved in maintaining them, and there was too little water and vegetation there. This fact was well known to him. His emirs and al-Qadi al-Fadil, as mentioned in the letter that he had sent to the Caliphate 3 years previously, when he asked to be given official authority in all of Greater Syria in addition to Egypt. We will not be able to prevail over the enemy from Egypt with the great distance and the lack of cities. The mounts on which we rely for jihad will be exhausted. On the other hand, if we stay here, there is a clear interest that will be served by that, and the benefit will be immense. There is enough power and the country is close by. Launching campaigns will be possible. Supplies will be simple. The horses will be rested. The troops will be great in number and opportunities will be available. The Battle of Ramlah confirmed the soundness of this way of thinking. And from that time, Salah ad-Din decided to move his permanent base, after rebuilding his military and political strength, to Damascus. Its military forces, some of which he had inherited from Nur-ud-Din, and its emirs like his, had lengthy experience in confronting the Crusader forces, and had better knowledge of the local geography, in addition to having short communications and supply lines, in contrast to the length of these lines for the enemy. As the base aim of his military operations in the future was to liberate Jerusalem, and recapture the lands which were under Crusader domination, Damascus was the most suitable main base for such operations. Hence Salah ad-Din made it his permanent base and did not leave it for Egypt except to check on the situation in the latter. The Battle of al-Qadi. Salah ad-Din remained in Egypt for a few months after the Battle of Ramlah, until he was certain that everything was under his control. Then he left and headed for Damascus, where he arrived on Saturday 24 Shawwal, 574 Hijri, that is April 1179 Common Era, and he stayed there for the rest of that year. All the battles that occurred during that time were no more than a few raids, and repelling a few attacks. In fact, Salah ad-Din was fully focused on the siege of Baalbek, after its rulers, Muhammad ibn Abd al-Malik, who was known as Ibn al-Muqaddim, refused to give it up to Saleh Turan Shah, the brother of Salah ad-Din. All the while, he did not ignore the fortress of Makhadat al-Ahsan, and he told his emirs that if the Crusaders finished building it, we will besiege it and destroy it, down to its foundations. After he had finished with Baalbek, he turned his attention to the fortress and asked the Crusaders to knock it down. In return, they asked him to pay them the costs they had incurred in building it. He offered them 60,000 dinars. Then he raised it to 100,000, but they rejected this offer. It so happens that in Dhul-Qa'dah 574 Hijri, that is April 1179 Common Era, Baldwin IV attacked some Muslim shepherds who had gone out to graze their flocks in the fields near Banyas, and Humphrey of Toron joined him in that. Salah ad-Din sent a military force, led by his nephew Izz-ad-Din Farrukh Shah, to find out what had happened, and they engaged with the enemy near Shaqi Farnoon, and defeated him. The king was only able to escape due to the courage of Humphrey, who was wounded in the battle, and died afterwards as the result of his wounds. His death was a great loss for the Crusaders. Salah ad-Din had left Damascus when he heard news of the victory, and went to lay siege to the fortress of al-Ahsan, but he limited his action to attacking its garrison, because it was so strongly fortified that he had to lift the siege after a few days. At that point, al-Qadi camped in the plain of Marja-Ayun, west of Banyas, and sent the troops to raid the Galilee and Lebanon, and destroy the crops in the lands between Tyre and Beirut. These raids angered Baldwin IV, who thought that he should put a stop to them, so he gathered his forces and set out to confront the Muslims, calling Reynald III of Tripoli to help him. He knew that Farrukh Shah was coming back from the coast with a great deal of booty, so he moved northwards to intercept him in the valley of Marja-Ayun, between the Litani River and the upper part of the Jordan. Salah ad-Din saw his movements, but whilst the Crusader king was engaged with Farrukh Shah, Raymond III and the Templars were coming towards the Jordan River, and at the entrance to the valley, they caught Salah ad-Din unawares. The Templars immediately hastened to engage in fighting, but Salah ad-Din stood firm in battle, and the military plans that he had implemented gave him the opportunity to launch a counterattack and achieve victory. The Crusaders turned tail and fled, not caring about anything. When they reached the royal army, panic spread through the ranks and they were compelled to go back. Then they began to flee. Many of them were taken captive, including Odo de Saint-Amand, the Grand Master of the Templars, Baldwin, ruler of Ramlah, and Hugh, the Count of the Galilee. The battle occurred at the beginning of 575 Hijri, that is, the summer of 1179 Common Era. But Salah ad-Din did not try to capitalize on this victory by attacking Jerusalem, because he believed that the Crusader king, who was still free, would be able to summon troops from different regions, and they would rally around him. This would make his mission more difficult, especially since a group of French knights had arrived in the kingdom at that point on a pilgrimage, led by Henry II of Champagne, which renewed the Crusaders' hopes and raised their morale. Instead of attacking Jerusalem, he attacked the fortress of Al-Ahzan in Rabiul Awwal, that is April, and after a siege lasting 5 days, he managed to breach its walls and destroy it completely, leveling it to the ground. He also raided the coastal areas, that are Tyre, Sidon, and Beirut, and his fleet attacked the city of Acre and destroyed the ships that were moored there. Truce between Salah ad-Din and Baldwin IV. The Crusader losses increased, and Baldwin IV was very upset by the Muslim victories, but he had no choice but to ask for a truce. Indeed, Salah ad-Din responded to Baldwin's request for a truce between them for his own reasons. 1. He wanted to annex Aleppo under his authority, before directing a decisive blow against the Crusaders. At the same time, he wanted to protect himself from Crusader attacks whilst he was attacking Aleppo. 2. He also wanted to launch an attack against Armenia. 3. He wanted to build a relationship with Kilij Arslan II, Sultan of the Seljuks of Rome, so that he could get him on his side, or at least ensure that he was neutral between him and the Crusaders. And 4. He wanted to focus on attacking the Principality of Tripoli. News had reached him that there had been contacts between the Crusaders and the Byzantines, aimed at forming a new alliance between them. The Byzantine fleet had attacked Tortouse, which was a town on the Syrian coast on the outer edge of the environs of Damascus. Salah ad-Din conquered an island in the sea nearby called Arwad, so Raymond was forced to make a truce with him, and asked to join him and become one of his allies, because of his dispute with the Kingdom of Jerusalem, which had led to him being deposed and expelled. As for Baldwin, he was exhausted as were his troops, because of their many confrontations with Salah ad-Din. Hence he wanted a truce because he needed to reorganize his troops and find new allies. The period of the truce between them was set at 2 years, and it seems that during the period leading up to the truce, Salah ad-Din had aimed at raiding the Crusaders in order to lead to a truce, to buy him time to build up and strengthen the Muslim ranks. Salah ad-Din and the thief knight, Reynald de Chatillon. Salah ad-Din benefited from the truce which he signed with the ruler of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, and moved his military activities to areas confronting the Crusaders in northern Syria. There were some successful sea raids against the Principality of Tripoli, which led to the Crusaders, under the leadership of Raymond III, making a truce with Salah ad-Din that lasted for 5 years, from 1180 to 1185 Common Era. Salah ad-Din benefited from his military and political achievements by focusing on his main goal, which was to unite Syria. He started his campaigns, which we have referred to, against the region of Mosul and followed that with the siege of Aleppo and gaining control of that city. Whilst Salah ad-Din's forces were besieging Aleppo, the Muslim forces in Egypt were carrying out successful military operations on the southernmost front in the region of Darum, between Gaza and Egypt. These battles in general proved that the most the Crusader front could do in this location was defend some of the areas under its control, and it lost the ability to attack when compared with its situation before the emergence of Salah ad-Deen al-Ayubi. The exception to that was the raids carried out by the Crusader ruler of Iraq, Reynald de Chatillon, who was regarded as coming under the authority of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Reynald was known as the Thief Knight even to the Franks, because he was not one of the type of knights who cared for their honor and adhered to the principles of knighthood. He was good for nothing but plunder, robbery, treachery, and launching raids against innocent Muslims. Some European historians described him as an example of the thief knight of his era. He was a man of greed, treachery, savagery, and blind fanaticism. The 15 years that he spent as a prisoner in Aleppo did not alter his behavior or discipline him. The historian Abu Shammah described him as the most treacherous, most evil, and vilest and basest of the Franks, the one most likely to break confirmed covenants and vows. Reynald ignored the truce that he had made between Salah ad-Din and the Kingdom of Jerusalem, and set out at the head of his forces, penetrating deep into the Arabian desert as far as Taima. His intention was to march from Taima to Medina to capture the holy places. But Farrukh Shah, the nephew of Salah ad-Din and his deputy in Damascus, hastened to launch a campaign in Jordan and the environs of Iraq, and plundered the region. Reynald returned to his principality to defend it, but not before plundering a large Muslim caravan, which was heading from Damascus to Mecca, and robbing it of a large amount of wealth. Hence Salah ad-Din got angry and sent word to the king of Jerusalem, blaming him for what had happened and reminding him of the truce between them, and demanding that he force Reynald to return what he had plundered. King Baldwin IV was very annoyed with Reynald too, so he sent word demanding that he return what he had plundered from the Muslims, and release their prisoners. But Reynald mocked his master, the ailing king, and refused to heed his orders. Reynald's campaigns were not in the Crusaders' interests with regarding to timing, as they came at a time when Salah ad-Din's strength was increasing, and the Kingdom of Jerusalem and the Crusader principalities were suffering from chronic internal problems with no solution. Seeds of doubt were sprouting between the ruler of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, Baldwin IV, and Bohemond III, ruler of Antioch, and Raymond III, ruler of Tripoli. In addition to that, these attacks came at a time when the Kingdom of Jerusalem was faced with problems concerning the health of Baldwin IV and the issue of succession. On the external front, Salah ad-Din's relationship with the Italian cities and with the ruler of the Byzantine Empire, Alexius Komnenos II, was growing stronger. Moreover, these campaigns of Reynald served to confirm the failure of the Kingdom of Jerusalem to control the lands belonging to it, as Reynald was supposed to be under the authority of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Yet he did not adhere to the truce between the kingdom and Salah ad-Din. In addition to that, Reynald's campaigns and the threats that they posed to the holy places had a positive impact on the Islamic front, as this conduct on Reynald's part made the allied Muslim forces in Greater Syria and Mesopotamia stand with Salah ad-Din. Salah ad-Din began to focus on punishing Reynald for his criminal activities against the merchant and pilgrim caravans. He set out to besiege Iraq more than once, in 580 Hijri, that is 1184 Common Era, and 583 Hijri, that is 1187 Common Era, as well as carrying out Muslim military operations on the northern front in the region of Tiberias in 583 Hijri, that is 1187 Common Era. These developments took place when the Islamic front was now united after the treaty was signed with the ruler of Mosul, and the Crusader front had been suffering from internal problems, which worsened after the death of Baldwin IV and assumption of power by Baldwin V in 1185 Common Era. He died 1 year later, as the result of which the Kingdom of Jerusalem entered a period of conflict over the succession to the throne, in which the Count of Tripoli, Raymond III, took part. Suspicions arose concerning the death of Baldwin V. Was it a natural death, or had those who harbored ambitions for the crown of the Kingdom of Jerusalem been behind this death? It was suggested that he had died as a result of being poisoned. The matter reached such a point that the Crusaders formed two opposing camps concerning the issue of who should inherit the throne of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. One group supported Guy of Lusignan and his rule of Jerusalem. Another group opposed his rule and was led by Raymond III of Tripoli and Bohemond III of Antioch. In this confusing internal situation on the Crusader front, which contrasted with the unity and strength on the Muslim side, the ruler of Iraq, Reynald, stirred up trouble with the Muslims. He went back to his old ways of not adhering to truces and covenants. He attacked a merchant caravan that was traveling between Damascus and Cairo, plundered what it was carrying, and took the merchants and guards captive. Salah ad-Din failed to persuade Reynald to hand over the prisoners or return the plunder. Similarly, the efforts of the King of Jerusalem to force Reynald to hand over what he had plundered from the caravan and to release the captives were unsuccessful. This led to a strong Muslim reaction on the part of Salah ad-Din, which led to the Battle of Hattin and its consequences, which we will discuss below, insha'Allah. End of Part 5 of Chapter 7.